Hello, everyone. Thanks for your time. It's great to be here. We have a lot that I will try to share today, and I hope I will help you with some of those questions to be asked. If you come out of this talk and you actually have some ideas of what to ask for the next talks, I will be already very happy. So before we start, I will try to do something that is very simple, right? And it's defining heaven. Right? I think it's very easy, right? Every culture could go and come into a very simple agreement that heaven is a place where the police are Britons, right? The cooks are Italian, mechanics are German, parties are in Brazilians' heads, and so on, right? So this is very, very easy to have an agreement on. If we had a world where this was the world, I think everybody would be happier and we would not have a problem. Unfortunately, of course, we live in the reality, and that's all mixed up. Every country tries to do one of those things, and everybody fails in all of them, right? But I think the best definition of hell is where the lawyers do exist. I think that's it's even funnier when you send that for legal review in a big corporation, right? So somehow the lawyers don't really like it, but at the same time, what can they really say, right? This is not really against the company rules. So I want to apologize in advance that I will make generalizations like this one. Of course, there are good lawyers. I'm married to one. But then I will try to make some claims and some things that are generalizations. I mean no offense to anybody. So for example, if I say that the academia needs to improve and needs to get into the state of the art so they can actually contribute to InfoSec, I'm not saying that there are no pockets in academia that actually are very helpful and are doing great work. I'm just saying the overall investment that happens in this area, overall number of things that come out from this area, maybe we are not there yet, right? So then I said a sentence really, really long ago that is if hacking is an art, please excuse me, but I will use the poetic license, right? So I think it is fine to make certain generalizations just to actually show the bigger picture, but I don't mean any offense. And of course, I'm not speaking for my employer. That would require huge committees agreeing with all those ideas. So instead, just understand that what I'm saying here is my view of something and is what I try to drive. It doesn't necessarily mean my employer agrees with that. Then recently I came up with this sentence that I'm sorry for the bad word, but I think it is really perfect to define my relation with troopers, right? You do what you love, and then it's not that then you will not work one day in your life. It's actually you work super fucking hard and everything will be personal, right? And my relation with troopers is really like that. It's 12 years of the conference. It's my 11th year here. Troopers is the first conference that I was invited to give a talk. Right, it's the conference where I met most of my really good friends and people that changed my career, like Sergey Bratos, who actually convinced me that formalization and the actual view of the academia was something very important. Where I met Edmund Rogers, who was the person who actually brought me to US, and many others along the years, right? So for me, it is a place where I feel home, right? I'm really, really glad to be here. So the objectives here of the talk is really I think a lot of the things that I will say are just obvious. For all of you, you will say, hey, yeah, but that's just common sense. But then if we don't really define a way to argue on common sense, we will end up arguing with people that don't really understand or don't have the same background. And then it's hard to actually discuss and organize the thought and actually making the convincing. And then we end up with decisions that are not necessarily the best. So what I will try to do here is creating these arguments and helping with those questions, right? I expect that this is more a discussion in the sense that I will give you some talking points. Hopefully along the conference we will discuss some of those. Don't necessarily agree with me, but use them as discussions, right? If you just go and say, hey, I don't agree with that point, but you're still discussing the point, I think that's good enough. But if you really need to define the objectives of a talk with one image, I like this one, right? It's interesting because Alberto Brandolini said a sentence, and I honestly don't know anything about the guy, but I completely agree with this sentence, where the amount of energy to refute bullshit is, of course, an order of magnitude bigger than to create it, right? And we see that everywhere in InfoSec, right? Someone goes, like say something, and then like there is like this huge like discussion that goes, but actually to prove that person is wrong takes much more energy than to actually make the original claim. This is going everywhere, and of course, social media just made it worse. It's happening in all the fields. I think like InfoSec is one of them, but that's the one that we care about right now, so that's the one that I will talk. But I'd like to use this image because in our team, like we were making fun out of like the way that security is done across, right? We were like, hey, you know what? When I find a bug, it's like the attacker is the all-powerful. I don't know if everybody remembers Doom, but the famous God mode, right? You are unkillable. You have all the weapons in the game. You can see the map and see all the enemies in the map. I mean, you are undefeatable, right? Like you will win the game. It's still fun because you're exploding stuff around. But then like that's when someone finds a bug, right? They go and they make these huge claims that the bug is exploited in all scenarios. All the world is doomed, right? I'm using a shirt that has a list of those bugs. Later on, someone will realize which bugs are those that I'm mentioning. But essentially, then like that's what happens when someone finds a bug. It's interesting because if you look into the work of sometimes the same researcher, when they are actually proposing a mitigation, and the attacker is this really dumb person, right? Like that really wants to dominate the world but can't do anything really right. Anything that you do to raise the bar kills the attack completely, and the world is now perfect. So it's a duality that we see in InfoSec. And it's interesting because it is normal. Like I think like everyone, when they find something, they want it to be more super important, or when they design something, they want it to be the solution. So I think that like it's a little bit of what everybody does, but then like in InfoSec, this is really big. It is so big that actually others came up with like the same kind of idea, but differently. So I like to cite like the Mitigator by Halvard Flake, right? So it basically raises the bar until bugs can't be seen, right? So, which is actually very common, right? Like in InfoSec, we hear this again and again. Yeah, but then like if we do this, we raise the bar. But what is really raising the bar? I thought that we were on exact sciences, right? So raising the bar, how much did you raise the bar? Is it like what you're really incrementing? Is this really more difficult for the attacker? Is it more difficult when the attacker is actually doing the attack or just in the development phase? What is the proportion of time between the development phase and the actually leveraging that? So there's a lot of things that the raising the bar does not really include, right? So as I said, there will be some points that I want you to take out. So I will give you 3 points. Just 3, okay? I will give the argument on why I believe that point is important and then the actual point. So the first one is like threat modeling overall is a well-defined process, right? Like, then like we learned like how to do like secure development life cycles. We learned how to do secure development engineering. That doesn't mean everybody does that. That doesn't mean it's mature everywhere. But then like there is a well-defined process there. Then like people tried a lot of things. They shared that knowledge. Corporations shared it, like institutions got into it, researchers know it. Then like the InfoSec industry kind of agrees that there is a good way of developing like secure software. But then like it's interesting that then like we don't do the same when we're discussing mitigations. And mitigations here, I mean about classes of issues. So when you don't know a specific instance of a vulnerability, but you want to make sure that even if that instance exists, it is not possible to exploit for the maximum compromise of the system. So you're trying to lower the impact of a compromise. So it's actually, for me, it was always interesting, right? Like the process people, they love to create all this SDL, these big ideas. All that exists, but for the mitigation side, raising the bar is more than enough, right? Like, and then you see raising the bar everywhere. So I remember then like a professor of mine, like a mathematician, actually joked with me that engineers do not real math, right? It's interesting because, of course, I was super offended. It came out that he was actually true. But then like engineers don't really do real math. So he was like saying that like the proof by induction for an engineer is like if it works for case 1, works for case 2, works for case 3, works for all cases. And then like while then like he was of course making fun because I'm an idiot, I do believe that like I will bite and I will use his claim and I will propose this for mitigations. If you're developing a mitigation for a class of vulnerabilities, that mitigation must work 100% of the time, make it completely unexploitable for at least 3 instances of that vulnerability. They're like, I'm fine if you go and find 3 instances for that mitigation that mitigation would kill. If you don't find it, maybe you don't need the mitigation, because if it doesn't really kill 3 because you don't know above 3 instances, is really the most important mitigation. Think about them like the value. Like every time you adding something to a system, it's increasing complexity. Complexity means more cost, more chances of making mistakes, or maintaining it. And mitigations, once they get into a system, they are never removed, right? Because who wants to be the person who removed the mitigation from the system and now a vulnerability that should not be exploitable became exploitable? Nobody wants to be that person, right? So once a mitigation makes in, nobody will ever remove it. The cost is there, the complexity is there. At some point, that mitigation is actually creating more bugs than defending. And yes, I'm talking about FSC Linux, but not only. But it's really just because nobody will want to give up at some point, right? It was just way too much investment in there. So let's try to see that and put it to proof. Like sometimes someone goes and say, hey, there is this new mitigation. Cool, show me 3 vulnerabilities that it really fully mitigates. I think it's like a very fair one. The second point is, even though there are not a lot of formalization of exploits, and of course, this is increasing, right? Like the formal work on trying to define exploit and transforming exploit writing from an art to actually something more like a scientific or more like an engineering, just understanding how an exploit works, just because you've been in a presentation and you had like a really good speaker, like you will see many in Troopers, that they really will give you a lot of understanding on why a vulnerability existed, how it was found, how it was exploitable. But then just having been in that presentation doesn't mean you were really able to do it. And then this is like a humbling moment, because you realize that there is a lot of things that that researcher didn't really tell you. Right? And the researcher it's not like that researcher holds information because they are evil. It's because there's a lot of things that they don't even know they know, right? You look into something and you already have some information of some things that will not work. Why would you try it? You already know it will not work. You already know things that work, so you will go for that. So you already have some understanding on the system, so you will not share certain things. So just seeing a presentation is not enough to claim that you understand how exploits really work. I love that sound. Yeah, mine is Darth Vader arriving, right? The Imperial music, so. But it works as well. Whatever keeps you awake. So one panel that I recommend, it's interesting because it was like a small panel, but they released all the notes from the panel on discussing exploit art versus engineering, was made in New York Poly University. So I do recommend everybody to have a look. But that brings me to the second point, right? Someone who's proposing a mitigation really needs to understand the problem. And understanding the problem can be done through actually writing exploits for that problem, or pairing up with someone who actually did that. And it looks like it's simple, but just doing CTFs is not enough for you to say that you really understand that class of vulnerability. It's not enough for you to go and propose a mitigation. You really need to get real-life software, real-life issues for really modern OSs with all kinds of state-of-the-art enabled in that OS. Then you are able to go and say, hey, I exploited a few of those. I fully understand that problem. I understand why that problem is exploitable. Now I can work on engineering the mitigation. That doesn't mean the exploit writer needs to do the mitigation engineering. That it can be just a pair up, right? You go, you find really excellent designers, excellent architects, and each person brings something to the table, right? But really, don't accept someone who never did it to actually be the one claiming that they have the mitigation, because likely they're missing a lot of things, right? And I think on that, as I mentioned, right, the knowledge that is shared in a presentation many times is not complete for different reasons. I like here to cite a talk that Alex Ionescu recently gave in a conference actually in Germany. And his talk was basically, what is my magic, right? So he wanted to share why he can do things so fast, why he's able to reverse engineer certain elements of Windows kernel much faster than anybody else. Microsoft barely released something and he already come up with the internals of that subsystem. A lot of people claim that, hey, he has access to the code and all, But in the end, in his presentation, he just shows that there is no magic. There is just like about 20 years of doing it again and over, full time, during all those years, during all the holidays that happened, during all family vacations that he missed, like missing the kids and all, right? Like all of that time created so much back knowledge that when he looks into something, it's just faster because there's a lot of mistakes that he just don't make. It's not like doing like it's magic. It's not like something impossible. Everybody that dedicates the time and actually the energy to do it will be able to do it at some point, right? I mean, assuming that we are all average, right? But the truth is, most will not, right? Most will not dedicate that time. Most will not dedicate that energy. And speakers, when they will share something that they did, they will go straight to what saves the time, that makes the presentation interesting and explains the problem. So a lot of those other things you just miss. You don't get just from the presentation. So here's one thing, do go and try, right? Just don't take things that are presented for granted. Try to reproduce the work, right? That's actually original science, right? And I think that's a bit of what the academia misses. It's like there's all these great papers with a lot of big claims, but where is the actual thing for me to try and reproduce that finding and come to the same conclusion? Most of the times, you are not able to. And then you are always like in this question, did I do something wrong? That's why I didn't come to the same conclusion? Did they lie that they actually got into that conclusion? Did I miss something? There is some secret sauce that I don't know, only the government can know. You don't know. And at that point, that paper, even though in theory has a lot of value, it don't really for science or for evolving the knowledge, right? So, I always say that as more as we learn, as more as we realize there is more things that we don't know, right? So it is very common that, right? Like you see that sometimes the speakers just hold something because they believe it is so obvious that they don't really understand too much if others will know it or not. For them, it's just something natural, and then there is a key point missing there. So reproducing and doing it ourselves is really important. So one thing that I want to say is that leverage the investments in offense, right? Like leverage the fact that there is a lot of people spending all this time. Don't just go and get the presentation, that's it, but then be sure that people are reproducing, that the science is evolving, that we are sharing more and more, but then use that to drive defense, right? I'm not saying that offense is more important than defense, I'm just saying that both are very important. Some companies will be less mature or will have less resources. They're not able to have it internally. But then you can always come to a conference and talk to actual researchers and make sure that you listen to what they have to say. Sometimes what they say in the talk is not the full picture, but if you go and just drink a beer with them, they will share much more. Leverage that, right? I really hope that more and more people realize that. And the companies are doing a lot of effort. Right now, there's a lot of corporations, I admire a lot the work by Google and by Microsoft on sharing a lot of this offensive work and how this is driving mitigations in their companies, and I hope that we see more of that. So what do I miss, right? As a researcher myself, other than what I mentioned, being able to reproduce certain work, certain papers, and here, I bashed academia a lot because they, in theory, are really scientific, right? But the same applies also to practitioners and researchers overall, right? But then, I really miss more of the time spent by the researcher on doing something, what the researcher knew when they started. I love the papers and presentations like the Pound-to-Own, where the researchers go and say, hey, how they found the issue, how they exploited the issue. I wish they shared even more about how much time they actually spent, right? Because it's common that someone goes and say, hey, I spent only a week on that. But then they're ignoring everything that they had as a background, and you don't know. So it's hard for you to really measure. So it would be cool to have even more of that data on how much the research actually knew when they started, what was the premises, what were the assumptions that they went first, mistakes that they made. I think this has much more value for us to actually also replicate and for us to actually expand that research to other areas, right? So I wish we had more of that. Of course, sharing exploits and sharing vulnerability research work, for me, it's key. A lot of people don't understand the importance of those exploits being shared. They're like, yeah, but it will take so much time for companies in the world to patch. What is the impact? But if we don't share, we don't create the next generation. The next generation will have more and more gaps because they are starting with a world that's much more complex than 20 years ago. So if they start already trying to exploit something in modern Windows, they will get frustrated. They will not be able to do it because there are so many other things that they need to know, and it will be so much time. So those work, like sharing this kind of work, is really key for them to also learn and then for the state of the art to evolve. Another thing that it's interesting because it looks like so trivial, but it is a data that is not really easily available. Is, for example, you have Metasploit. Metasploit has a lot of tags for searching exploits. So you can know, hey, which targets an exploit works on. Does this exploit bypass ASLR or not? But one thing that is not trivial to collect is like, okay, this exploit might not bypass ASLR, but could it? Right? We don't know. We don't know if whoever created that module just decided that this ASLR was not important at that time for whatever reason, or if they just couldn't bypass, but maybe it is possible that person just didn't know, or you do need another info leak primitive that vulnerability don't give, so that's why it does not bypass ASLR. So there's a lot of things there that is like information that is just not provided. And as the time passes, this information is in theory very useful, but it gets lost, right? Like, how now are we gonna find the original exploit writer that did that working on the module, which kind of notes they kept, and the information essentially gets lost. To go and try to compile it, it will take a while. So I have simple questions that are very hard actually to answer nowadays. So I will give an example, right? Memory that is, executable only, meaning that you can execute but you cannot read, is something that the paging in Intel architecture do not provide. But actually in Itanium, we had it, right? Army does have it. Intel has a technology called memory protection keys that can provide that for you. Is it worth to enable in browsers? Will it actually prevent any vulnerability from being exploitable? It's a simple question, but you need to have a lot of experience with a lot of different browsers in a lot of different classes of vulnerabilities in those browsers to actually see if any of those would actually be mitigated by enabling the technology. And this is not an easy to obtain information. And it's just one example, right? It's just on the top of my mind. There are likely many, many others. Many things that could be developed in terms of mitigation, it's very hard to define if it would really be effective. And getting all this from even the public sources of vulnerabilities is not trivial. So maybe it's time that we start doing something. One point that I like to mention, really, really many years ago, I wrote a blog post in Portuguese only because I thought that it was completely irrelevant. And somehow it is still irrelevant, I guess. But which I called the fallacy of the defense in depth. Right? There is always this idea that, hey, I have multiple layers of defense, right? Defense in depth came from the military, right? The idea was the enemy would break one layer, so you have time to relocate troops to a given place. You have time to actually react, and you are able to detect that they actually broke this layer. Defense in depth mostly doesn't work in the virtual world, right? Think about DEP, ASLR. The attacker, yes, when they write in the exploit, they will spend a little bit more time, but once the exploit works, it will bypass everything simultaneously. There is no new alert because you have one or the other. This is not defense in depth. Yes, it gives you resilience against certain vulnerabilities. It makes classes of vulnerabilities harder to exploit. There is a lot of benefits on that. I'm not saying to not use it, but that's not defense in depth. There are defense in depth mechanisms in computer world, but those are not the ones, right? So be a little bit careful on what really you're getting from, and is that really defense in depth? I want to also give kudos, and since bug bounties were mentioned, right, by the work by Katie on bug bounties is impressive. For me, she is involved since the very beginning, since where it started. She's driving the industry. She's really well aware. She published really good work, and she incentivized the research in other work. Some folks are comparing bug bounty results with Pareto, right? So have very few researchers that actually find most of the issues. But the truth is, they go to the very easy issues, so they get the payouts really quickly. So it's not really helping in terms of quality. It's cool, there's a lot of countries where even a small payout make a huge difference. I'm from Brazil, I know very well that. So, but that doesn't mean that bug bounties really bring thousands of people to look into something. More than that, I think the statistics already show that it's really a minority of the folks that are actually making a living out of bug bounties. But I think the statistics also not counting from a very trivial thing, which is like a lot of those corporations, they don't even have the maturity to define what is really a vulnerability. Is this really exploitable vulnerability or not? So you see CVEs being released every day for a lot of things that are definitely not exploitable, but someone decided, and who knows, right? So the maturity is not there. So a lot of the bugs that in theory are being classified as bugs are probably not even real, right? So, and that's actually another problem. As I mentioned, the data that is available to us nowadays is really bad. So a lot of those CVEs, they are not really security issues. So then how do you really know what you're counting or what you're comparing? That's why metrics that use CVEs to actually justify certain things are not necessarily very good. So I talked a little bit about the importance of formalization, right? So I want to basically mention some work that has been done in the past years there, and some work that I still believe needs to be done, right? I think LangSec helped a lot in not formalizing the exploit side, but formalize a big chunk of the issues that are related to inputs and parsers. They helped, for example, everybody understand that the code is actually driven by data, so it's easier for people to understand why certain classes of vulnerabilities exist, why certain things are harder to mitigate. But then I also think that LangSec showed us that some of our very basic assumptions are really either wrong or needs to be revealed or needs to be better defined because they just don't really work as we thought they would. I got two examples that are essentially the same examples, but then they have some differences. But in secure development, we always say as a rule, right, the input should be checked as close to the use of that input as possible. Another rule in secure development is hey, we need to have functions that are intrinsically secure. They are secure by themselves. They don't depend on something else actually making sure they are secure, right? That's why we say string copy is not good because it depends on something else checking the input, right? These are basic rules in secure development, but then LangSec in the other side say that then you need to recognize your input straight in your parser. Your parser is the one that really knows if the input is valid and is your recognizer. So it needs to be straight into the moment you receive it, not spread around what they call shotgun parser, which is a parser that is everywhere in your code, because that's very hard to really guarantee it's correct. It's not that the two contradict themselves, but then we do see that then we need to relook a little bit on the guidance and maybe redefine that guidance a little bit better to actually make it make more sense. Still talking on formalizations, right, and things that formalizations change in the world. So Julian Vannigan, I'm a big fan of his work doing heap modeling, where he's trying to demonstrate all the heap operations as mathematical formulas, and that is actually essential for us to think about mitigations on the heap, classes of vulnerability that involve heap, and auto-generate exploits for heap overflows, as Thais is actually working on and trying to do some of that. So I think this is a brilliant area to go and work on formalizations. Of course, then in that area as well, we know DARPA efforts that I didn't even cite, but then where they putting a competition together, they put a competition together to try to create exploit auto generation, and it's actually also results of coming from formalizations, right? Halvar also recently released a paper on the weird machine, on trying to define vulnerabilities in the scope of a Turing machine, something that computer scientists will definitely understand, and I think those works are great to try to bring more folks to the state of the art. Of course, this is not a comprehensive list. There's so many people doing a great work, right? My intention was not to be comprehensive, was just to point and give some references. But one thing that for me is always interesting is to consider one area looking to something that has similar complexity and similar challenges. A while back, I tried to compare InfoSec with chess games, right? And I showed that a lot of the things from chess that were learned from dozens of years ago, they do apply to InfoSec. But then recently, I was reading a blog post, so not as recent now, maybe more than a year now, on compression. And it's interesting that like this practitioner guy, like someone who basically writes the compression algorithms and compression algorithms, he basically in a blog post, he concluded something about compression that for me it's actually super interesting. Because he basically said that a modern compressor is a bit like a compiler. The compressed data is a kind of a program in bytecode, and the decompressor is just an interpreter. So it's interesting because this is really similar to what LangSec came with, like, hey, data drives code, and that's like why you need to recognize that data. So even though it's a completely different field, the practitioners, they actually see and they realize that, right? They realize the ways to abstract compression. They might not care. Like this guy, he just posted in a blog, right? He didn't write a super academic paper that got into a top conference and then everybody can cite. But it's amazing that he came up with the similar conclusion by himself in a completely different area. So there's a lot that we can learn from the practitioners, right? From people that actually doing good work there. There's some kudos that needs to be given to Microsoft. Microsoft, like Matt Miller, has been doing an amazing work on showing some of the ideas behind their mitigations, right? The data that they used to come to the conclusion that A was more important than B, why they got there, and even sharing the internals on how they find vulnerabilities to help others like find vulnerabilities in their products. I think that's been really great work coming out of Microsoft. But then I really like to talk about Jira work because this is for me the precursor of defining exploits in a different way, right? Which is from 2002. So Jira, for those who don't know, is one of the founders of Core. Like he's not with the company anymore, but he's kind of not human, right? Like that person is he's different, you know, like somehow he was always ahead of the time, right? And he needed to teach new exploit writers in the company how to actually think about the vulnerabilities and try to get them up to speed. And he created this presentation and then he shared it with the world where he defined the primitives. So he talks about what you can do and how you can change things that are like those primitives to actually achieve like your objective. So it was kind of like very informal. It's not really a formalized, but he already introduced some of the terminology that still nowadays are like the way of looking to the problem. So, and that's like way back. ROP, for example, even though everybody attributes ROP to an academic paper, ROP existed for many, many years before it was formally defined by the academics. The formal definition was still important because that's what people cite. It's a term that is now common. Everybody uses the same term. Everybody knows what they're talking about when they define about ROP. So there is an importance that it end up defined, but it is something that the actual exploit writers already knew for a while. A while back, I was in a mathematics class with another professor. That professor loved to play chess. So in the class breaks, we played chess all the time. And then he was always interested in what I did at the time. I was an exploit writer. I think we will discuss some of that on the ethics panel. But my job was basically write the exploits. Sometimes I was finding the vulnerabilities that I was writing the exploits for. Sometimes other teams in the company that I worked for at the time were the ones finding the vulnerabilities and I was just writing the exploit. But that professor, he really, really thought it was an interesting area. And then because he was a mathematician, he challenged me to actually define exploit writing using set theory. As I said, before I met Sergey Bratos, I didn't give a crap really about academia, but I did respect this professor. He was brilliant. Like he's still alive, so like he's still brilliant. But then I was like, yeah, you know what? I will try it. So I did a try for his class, but then I kind of dropped. I didn't care too much. I didn't really care about publishing or anything. I presented to the class, but that was pretty much it. But along the years, even more after I met Sergey, I did try to use the same ideas and when I talk to people, right? Every time I was talking about defining a vulnerability, I would talk about hey, let's create a set. Let's define the different vulnerabilities that we need to actually get into the objective. Let's define the primitives. And I always use that to talk to people. And one of my teammates, he convinced me that we should actually go and write it down and put do all the formulas back, and we published that in the LangSec workshop past year. So the work was done with 3 of my teammates. The credit should go all for them. So the idea was from my professor, the actual work was from my teammates. I'm just here saying it. So Kekai, Key, and Enrique. So I recommend you to have a look into it. But just to say that what was the contribution in this work. Essentially, we defined that exploit primitives are doing like what the attacker actually obtained. It can be through a security vulnerability, but some primitives are just there. It's just the way that the system was built, right? So for example, like in the Linux kernel, doing like in the past, now they're trying to fix it, but a lot of pointers of the kernel were just available for user mode processes. It was just there, it was available. It's not really a vulnerability because it's part of the design of the system. Now they're considering it a vulnerability because it breaks KSLR, but at the time they were not, so that was just inherent. But it's still available, the information is available, right? So some things are obtained because of vulnerability. So you can get a read primitive because of a given vulnerability on the system. P-Patch, right, like the creator of PAX, he defined like how they look into it when they actually defining a mitigation. And it's interesting because they defined that there is the primitive type that gives you read, write, or execute, but then they also defined like primitive properties. That is basically when you get this read or write or execute primitive. Is it fully controlled or partially controlled, right? Is that for any memory area or for like a given memory area? Can you repeat it multiple times or not? So we leverage that to define the exploit primitives, and I will show why formalization is actually important, because I will show there is one primitive that escaped us, right? Because there was no formalization. Once you formalize and you start applying different vulnerabilities in there, you see, wait a minute, I'm getting a property here that is not defined yet, right? So I will explain in a minute. Then we defined that the exploit objective is really what you need to unite to actually what you actually want to achieve, right? So for example, sometimes you just want a data from a database. So there's multiple ways that you can do it. Sometimes you want actually code execution. Sometimes you just want the ability to pivot to another machine. So that actually talks about the kind of vulnerability we need, right? The exploit condition is really how many exploit primitives you need to chain together to get into the exploit condition, to the exploit objective, sorry. That's interesting because once you model it, you start seeing that, for example, Chrome, like escaping sandbox, there were cases where you needed to chain 13 different vulnerabilities to actually get into your exploit objective, right? If you look into Pound2Own, recently there was one, like a remote code execution for Android, unauthenticated, right? And the guys chained, I think it was 12 different logical bugs to actually get into the objective, right? So it's a good mode. And then exploit difficulty is really what is the complexity for that exploit? And the idea here is just so we could differentiate what is a probabilistic versus what is a deterministic mitigation. So going into that, on the probabilistic versus deterministic, right? Of course, the empirical understanding, the thing that is kind of normal, is you say something is deterministic, meaning that this mitigation is exact, right? There is no bypasses for that primitive in that given case for that mitigation. It works as is, right? There is no dependence on the statistics or timing or any probability, right? While probabilistic, you're basically adding a probability. So the attacker still has a chance of succeeding, brute forcing might be possible. You might need to chain it with something else. It starts getting complicated when you start to look into actual real cases, right? So this is the case analysis that we will try to present here, which is imagine like this. You have encryption, right? So you have AES, 128, data at rest, you generate the keys properly, using proper mode. The data is just stale. Someone just steals the data. They don't have the key, they don't have a way to obtain that key. It will take a really long time for them to actually break it. Even though it is probabilistic, there is a chance that they might find out the key, right, through brute forcing. But it's not really a realistic attack. If you think about the probability, it's so big that it gets into, we can consider this as a deterministic mitigation. But the same mechanism, if we just change a little bit how the system operates, and now instead of the data being at rest, we're saying that the data is in use by the actual machine, we completely change the way that this mitigation works. And I will show you why, okay? But it's actually important to actually play those exercises. So that comes with this new primitive, right? In 2017, when I presented in Troopers, I discussed a little bit about memory encryption and attacks against encrypted memory. I will do a wrap out of what I presented in 2017, and then we will discuss a little bit about what is new for today. But essentially, the idea of an attacker not being oblivious to memory changes is something that was not necessarily very relevant before, right? Think about, if you have a memory that is encrypted, and the attacker still observes that memory, the attacker only sees encrypted data. But the attacker still has the ability to observe, right? So the attacker still sees memory changing. They don't know what is really changing, but the attacker has this observation. We demonstrated, and that was the presentation in 2017, that just by this observation, we are able to actually find a lot of things in memory, where they are located. So we know, for example, hey, this is my process, or this is a given target process. Hey, I know that this is where certain data of that process is there. I don't know the data, I don't really know the content, but just by the pattern analysis of the changes, you are able to determine that. And this is what we called, it's an attacker that is non-oblivious to the changes. I do believe that this was kind of like something that practitioners already saw in other exploits, right? Some info leaks, they only give you a notion that the state is changing. And this is basically where non-oblivious to that state change. But it was not ever really defined as that. So I'm not claiming this is something new, I'm just claiming that it was not really named before. So if we think about doing this attacker, right? An attacker that is able to read and write into memory, right? But the memory is encrypted. The attacker has no key. So he reads encrypted, he writes. It's kind of like a random corruption that happens there because he don't really control the operation after. Can that attacker really win? So we proved that the attacker can. I will explain quickly. But then at the same time, why someone would encrypt the memory if the attacker can still win? Well, it is a deterministic protection against cold boot attacks, where the memory is not reused anymore, right? Someone just stopped the machine, gets the run somewhere else, it's encrypted, the key is not even there in the new machine, right? Because the key is not in the run. So it is still doing very deterministic protection. It is an effective protection against this attack. So how this memory encryption works, right? Essentially, you have a package of the CPU. Anything that leaves the package of the CPU and goes to the system goes basically encrypted. Inside the CPU caches or inside the CPU boundary, basically the data is unencrypted, so it's available, right? And of course, then the CPU makes sure that it takes care of which process accessing or which VM or whatever, right? There's a lot of implementation details from different implementations. Just a disclaimer, I will show a list of technologies that use memory encryption. I'm not claiming all of them are vulnerable or not vulnerable, right? I'm just showing that a lot of people believe that those technologies are about to come to the market, but they already exist for a while, right? So for example, Xbox uses a hybrid approach. Some memory areas are encrypted, some memory areas are encrypted with integrity protection and replay protection. Nintendo 3DS, actually in the same troopers we released the work against attacking memory encryption. POC GTFO had an article against bypassing the security of the Nintendo 3DS. Apple Security Enclave use encrypted memory. There was a good talk by Tarjay. Intel ME, like SGX, use with replay protection and integrity. Total memory encryption and multi-key memory encryption by Intel announced, but there is no CPUs available in the market now. They use memory encryption. AMD SEV and SME do same thing, use memory encryption, right? So memory encryption is already existent in many places, and it's going to be mainstream soon. Right? So all your desktops will have encrypted memory, servers will have encrypted memory, so a lot of things change there. The attack that we showed in Troopers was interesting because since we can actually find the location of stuff in memory and we can flip bits randomly, we can do a data-only attack in code that has logic, for example, like this. And actually we demonstrate against the logging process in Linux. So it supports a pre-authentication, basically doing even if it's disabled, it does support it, so you could enable it, right, in theory. So pre-authentication is supported. There is a flag that is maintained in memory for actually defining if the pre-authentication actually happened. So the way that the code authenticates you, basically it goes and say, hey, is the pre-authentication enabled? If it is, it calls a function that basically looks, for example, into your domain or Kerberos server to see if you already authenticated. And if you did, it sets a flag. So later on, the logic goes and sees if the flag is set. It bypasses asking you for a password. It just gives you the login, right? Of course, if an attacker can modify memory at any point, the attacker can just go. Even if the pre-auth is not really enabled, the attacker can, at this point, modify the flag and basically bypass the actual authentication logic and get shelled. That's what we demonstrated. And why the attacker is able to do it? Because everything related to pre-auth is in the same memory area. So when you corrupt, even though you're corrupting everything else, it's not in use, so it doesn't really matter. It doesn't crash. It doesn't really get invalid values. And this if is basically checking if the value is not 0, right? So any flip, there is really, really low chances that this will actually end up being 0, right? So 2 to the power of 32 minus 1, chances that it will not be 0, right? So therefore, you win as an attacker. So that was like trivial and all, like cool. But then like a lot of people said, hey, but what if you go and change that code logic? Because like this code is interior secure code. You should basically go and here say, hey, if pre-out equals to 1, do that. And then the attacker now needs to have pre-out equals to 1 instead of like just different than 0, right? It would be completely different game. While I don't think you can change all the software to find all those conditions, I accepted the question, I accepted the challenge to have a look. So if you look into memory encryption, you start seeing memory in a different way. Imagine that now, instead of seeing addresses as bytes, right, byte addressable, you can see them as basically blocks of the cipher size, right? In this case, most of the implementations are AES 128, so I will just say block size are 128 bits. So imagine that like memory itself, everything is encrypted, and they are those blocks of encrypted memory. Every time the CPU fed something to the cache, it will decrypt the actual block, and it will come to the cache, right? Obviously, the cache lines are bigger than 128, meaning that every time you do a code fetch or code write, you actually pull in more than only one of those encrypted blocks. But what matters is like the blocks themselves are just doing like 128 bits. That basically means that every time you modify something in the block, as a property of encryption, you modify everything in that block with a random probability, right? If I flip any bit in the block, so imagine that this is one block. If I flip one bit on the encrypted block, it's a property of the cipher that will be propagated at the decryption, right? Because I don't have the key. I didn't really do the proper encryption to actually do the flip. I just flipped in memory, CPU fetch the value, it does the decryption, and then now the entire block gets corrupted. It's interesting because while the data at rest, this is amazing property, when we think about the data in use, we have different elements in that block. You can have, for example, a variable that is 8 bits, a variable that is 16 bits, a variable that is 32 bits in the same block. Meaning that if you corrupt something, you're corrupting all of those. But the chances of you getting the value that you want is basically proportional to the size of that variable, right? So if you have a variable that is 8 bits, 2 to the power of 8, you're definitely going to get the value that you want, right? If it's 32 to the power of 32, right? So if the attacker is able to do the same attack multiple times without actually breaking the system, the attacker still wins. And then that's what we call a feasible brute force corruption, random corruption, right? And here the idea is think about the primitives again. It's really powerful. The attacker, if you look into the properties of those primitives we give into an attacker that can read and write memory, basically they can do that at arbitrary addresses. They have partially arbitrary content because even though they don't control the cipher, they can actually do it multiple times and the flips are random, but they cause the flip, right? They have an arbitrary operation, right? Because they're doing the flip, so the data is changing. They do have that for an arbitrary number of times, because they can keep repeating it until they succeed. They do that at an arbitrary time in the program. So the system doesn't even know this attacker is there. It's running besides the fact that the system is actually processing things. And the attacker is non-oblivious. That's a lot of properties we're giving to an attacker. So there is no way that this is not exploitable, right? It's just if you think about as an exploit writer, it was already obvious when you look into the problem. But as a non-exploit writer, if we go and start showing the number of properties that we're giving, it starts getting easier for people to figure out that, hey, yes, it's way too much power. Notice that what we really changed with encrypted memory is that instead of fully arbitrary content, now it's a partial arbitrary content, right? And instead of giving a read primitive, we just gave them the non-oblivious. It's just a small primitive change. We didn't really break much, right, for this attacker. So I will just show one example of this how this vulnerability can be exploited with this brute forcing approach, just because you could go against the login. but the logging system never changes that if not 0. So there is no point on going after that because that's still broken with the old attack, so we decided to find some new target, just to show an example. It's not very realistic, but it is one example, right? So the Linux kernel manages structures using like a task structure, right? Like, so it has one per processes. So then like every time you're spawning a process, you will have like a task structure associated to that process. Even threads will have like a task structure. They will just share a thread group, right? That structure has many elements that are necessary for controlling the task. Then like for the privileges, it basically allocates one specific data structure that's the credit structure. And then like this comes like from the small pool allocator, so it's like a very specific allocator in the kernel, but overall, then like it is something that is known behavior. The credit structure like has lots of elements. So I will show one that we are interested in, which is the effective user ID. Our idea is to make the effective user ID of a process basically 0. And then with that, we can change the effective user ID. For example, the effective group ID, we can change like all the other IDs, and we can do a lot of like damage to the system, right? There is a lot of other mitigations that can come in place in certain systems, but like let's just imagine like the basic work of the system. When you think about the data structure, a lot of people are concerned in those attacks, hey, but do I need to have cache alignment? Do I need to care about memory alignment? I will even ignore for now that the actual structure is aligned in memory because that's good for performance. Even if it were not, the blocks, the adjacent blocks are all related to the same structure for the same process. So as long as you found the credit structure for a process that is not in it, because if you damage in it, you might have a big problem. Like you might create like some like problems in the system, but you're not gonna break that system. But finding your own process is actually very easy if you are able to spawn processes in the system. I will explain in a minute why. But the good thing is you can just go and flip and don't need to worry too much on the adjacency itself, as long as you found the cred. So you have a lot of those premises, right? If you think about the premises that you need and you look into this data structure, we actually hit all the premises. We have all the conditions we need to actually exploit that using this data structure. So I did that just as a formalization, but usually when you write an exploit, you start making some notes on things that you need to pass. This one actually fits all. So then, I always think that the babies are probably coming out of the aliases at this point because we will control the system will do something that it was not expected. There's a lot of limitations on that, right? So just to be clear, then I assume, for example, in here that I have a local process running on the machine that can spawn other processes. That process is not privileged, and I want that process to actually be privileged. I do believe then these are make it less interesting right now, but at the same time, it's not unrealistic. If you really think about doing a server, for example, if you find a vulnerability in any of the remote processes in the server, usually you have an unprivileged access. But now you do have some access in the system, and then you can launch the same attack. So even though it's limited, then it is an example, I think it is a valid example. Just to actually say something, I will show the video of this actually running, okay? So while we open for questions. So I want to actually give my conclusions before then we open for questions. But then as I told you, there is only 3 things that I really care that you remember, right? Forget about the primitives of non-obliviousness, forget about encrypted memory. This is all to show that then when you formalize, it's easier to demonstrate something. It starts getting more obvious, right? You see that the primitive is still there, so the mitigation will not work. You see that the attacker has way too many primitives. They definitely will find a way to actually bypass your security mechanism. But then in the end, what we really need to remember is that why this happens. It happens because every time someone is talking about a new mitigation, they don't really go and prove this mitigation is really effective against real cases of that vulnerability. Right? I saw it multiple times of people coming and offering a mitigation because one new vulnerability is found, and they believe there will be a class of those, and they create this super complicated issue, super complicated mitigation that bring more problems than actually it solves, and then there is no more instance of that vulnerability even. So was it actually you, did you really need to spend that time doing that engineering? Did you really improve security? Maybe you actually didn't. The second is understanding the problem is key. You know, a rule that we follow as a team is yes, we found many vulnerabilities, and we want the vulnerabilities to be fixed as quick as possible. So we do try to report really fast. But every time we're dealing with something new, it's either a new technology or a new place inside the new technology, or maybe even a new style of vulnerability inside a technology, we write an exploit. The exploit is the definitive proof that we really fully understood that vulnerability. Once we have it, then we can talk about the internals, the actual impact, why this happens. We can really see if other instances of this kind of vulnerability will really exist in that technology, and then we might be able to talk about mitigations. Before that, any talk about mitigations is likely going to be irrelevant, really. And then I do believe that the investments in defense should be driven by the investments in offense, guided by it, should leverage it. That doesn't mean defense is harder or offense is harder. I just think it's different areas that really need to be in sync. They really need to collaborate and work together. Otherwise, we are not able to do security in many of the different fields. So I really appreciate your time. This is my contact. I will also be around the conference. I think maybe we have some time for questions. So I will let the video be playing on that attack going into a system. So the way it goes is we have a victim VM, and we have an attacker. Basically, the system has multi-key memory encryption, meaning that every time you're switching VMs or go into the host, you have a different key that is used. So even though the hypervisor provides a debugging interface to the victim memory, when you actually in another VM, if you're fetching things through the debugger of the hypervisor, you're using a different key. So you actually don't see the real memory contents. The attacker basically spawn a process. That process starts forking a lot of different processes. So we can dump the memory and actually see the changes and locate where our process is. The cool thing about those allocators, even more like these small object allocators, is that every time that they try to avoid fragmentation, so if we allocate a lot of process, when we kill one, we know where the next allocation is going to come. If we're fast enough between creating and killing the process, we know where in memory something is. So that's the principle of no obliviousness. Even though it's encrypted, we can still find it. And since we could find it, we can do the flips. And as you can see here, we start doing the flips, and of course I'm not printing every flip because this is a brute force for 2 to the power of 32 times, right? So it would destroy my screen, so I'm printing every 1,000,000 or something. So, and then I'm just printing the new UID, and you can see the process doesn't really crash because the UID is an unsigned int, even though I'm printing it's assigned, so you see some negative values, but the system will not crash. And you just keep doing until you manage to get into 0. In that machine, for 32 bits type, it was 15 minutes. A VM attacking another VM with encrypted memory and everything. So it's doable. As you can see, the brute force will keep going. At some point, it will be 0. It will read a secret, and the video will restart. So, questions? Thank you.